It could happen for all sorts of reasons. Maybe your supervisor is unavailable and asks you to fill in, or you're applying for your first teaching job at a university. You're about to deliver your very first lecture. Teaching and communication is not embedded into research training as much as we would like, so there is an assumption that all researchers should be effective teachers. I don't think any teacher tries to deliberately do a bad job, but perception is reality. It's very easy to seem like you're just going through the motions. If you're slightly underprepared or not too familiar with the material, before you know it, you're reading off the slides word for word. If you go the other route and completely script your lecture and memorize every single word, you might talk too fast on the day, may prevent students connecting with you or the material. Hello, I'm Jack Wang, a microbiologist and science educator, and the 2020 Australian University Teacher of the Year. I've been in this exact position, and at the time there was nobody to ask about how I should write and deliver my first lecture. This was back in 2010, and although I had quite a lot of teaching experience in other delivery modes, I'd never lectured before. Presenting a lecture was built into the interview process for my job, and I had to figure this out on my own. This video is designed for early career researchers who may very soon be in that position. And what I recommend is not to focus on yourself and all the way things might go wrong on the day. It's actually more productive to think about your audience and what value you're able to give the students through your class. This student-centered approach has served me quite well. So today, let's talk about 5 tips for preparing and presenting your first lecture. First of all, why should they care? I think it's fair to say that the student experience is more complicated than ever, and they need to jump through many hurdles just to make it to class. Balancing family responsibilities with part-time work and persistent bad weather or bad traffic is enough reason for many students to not attend classes in person at all. In this delicate learning environment, teachers need to do a fair amount of recon and target audience research before you even start preparing your first lecture. What degree or program are your students enrolled in, and at what year level? How many lectures have they had so far? What topics were covered and in what depth? Are there any other learning activities before or after your lecture? And how does your topic fit in with assessment in the course? Perhaps most important of all, is the topic relevant in any way to current affairs, and can you connect the material to students' everyday lives? I spent weeks before my first lecture attending other people's lectures and watching online videos relevant to my topic so that I could pitch the content at the right level for third level undergraduate students. Once I knew what I was dealing with, I could then set the right learning objectives for my class. It's very easy to be caught up with what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it, but ultimately what matters is what students learn. Learning objectives define what students should be able to demonstrate by the end of a lecture, learning activity, or course, and it is very useful to outline these learning objectives as the very first or second slides in your lecture. They guide your thinking about how to organize the material and are also useful for students as part of their revision. Setting learning objectives is a whole discipline or art unto itself, but what learning designers have gradually taught me over the years is that for a 1-hour lecture, you want to set 3 to 5 learning objectives. Ideally, they're higher up on Bloom's taxonomy of learning complexity, not just define or describe, but instead higher order learning that encourages students to compare and contrast or explain and evaluate a range of different concepts. This all sounds quite abstract, but one practical way of doing this is to present the same concept using different case studies or examples. When I talk about energy transfer or metabolism in biology, we cover respiration, converting glucose into ATP, as well as photosynthesis, using light energy from the sun to create simple sugars in plants. This implicitly or explicitly requires students to compare these 2 different processes against the backdrop of a common underlying theoretical concept. So hopefully it increases their overall understanding of energy transfer. Now that you've set the learning objectives or LOs, you need to make sure that your lecture allows students to meet these learning objectives. Do your slides cover all of the relevant information, or at least direct students to the right sources? Do you talk about the concepts in enough detail and explore theoretical assumptions through sample problems that you work through? This idea is very common in educational design, and of course I'm referring to Biggs's theory of constructive alignment. Learning objectives need to align with the learning activity, which aligns with the assessment tasks that ultimately evaluates student learning. Each of these components are aligned, in sync, and promote students' active construction of their own understanding, which results in the desired learning outcomes. To paraphrase Biggs, the learner then finds it difficult to escape without learning appropriately. What does this mean for you, writing and delivering your very first lecture? If you can provide sample problems for students to answer and exam questions with worked model responses for the coordinator, everyone wins. In fact, you should consider writing some draft questions before you even write the lecture itself. This makes it more likely that the content you're presenting is directly aligned to the style of questions you want students to be able to answer in the final exam, which perfectly aligns back to your learning objectives. Writing sample questions is not just useful for the final exam, it can also help model higher order learning for your students during class. This is broadly referred to as active learning, which falls under the theory of constructivism. Students need to actively construct their own understanding to maximize learning, instead of passively receiving information from their teachers. In 2014, Freeman et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 225 studies comparing student performance in STEM courses that incorporated active learning instead of traditional lectures alone. They found that students in active learning classes, on average, demonstrated a 6% improvement in exam scores, and that students in traditional lecturing classes were 1.5 times more likely to fail the course overall. Now, this doesn't mean that every class you teach has to be nothing but problem solving. Problem solving actually has a higher cognitive load and burden than sitting and listening. So mixing and matching these approaches works best, especially if you're teaching first-year students. You can start by interspersing short quiz questions throughout your lecture, audience polling software on mobile phones, or gamifying the content using platforms like Kahoot can work really well. Think, pair, share activities are also a viable option. Open-ended, thought-provoking questions that facilitate peer-to-peer student discussion in pairs before inviting students' shared responses to the question to the rest of the class. While these strategies can work really well to promote student engagement, they do take up more time. So you need to be strategic about what to include in your PowerPoint presentation slides. And finally, we get to the actual nitty-gritty, preparing your learning materials for the lecture. 30 slides is what most lecturers can get through and cover in a 1-hour time slot, especially once you factor in active learning discussions. When designing a slide, a useful framework to consider is Mayer's multimedia learning theory, which essentially states that people learn better through multi-sensory presentation of audio and visual stimuli. You want students to be listening to you during the lecture while looking at graphics on screen, and this dual-channel processing of information can augment their understanding. Use photos and diagrams wherever possible to support or replace text, and embedding audio or video clips can present the same concept through different perspectives. Each slide should have clear headings against the backdrop using simple color schemes, and core concepts should be highlighted to signal their importance to students. Including sample questions into the slides themselves will emphasize active learning as part of the lecture structure and also help students see the alignment between the material and the learning objectives. The reason that this is the last point I'm focusing on is that your slides will make more sense to everyone, including yourself, if you've already figured out the learning objectives and how you like to assess them. We can get caught up in the busy work of making pretty graphics and PowerPoint slides and can lose sight of what matters most at the end of the day: how this material facilitates student learning as part of an overall learning activity. This brings me to a final bonus tip: presentation style. Every person on social media seems super charismatic these days, and TED Talks have set the bar very high for the average presenter. The videos I've seen on how to give lectures seem to focus disproportionately on style, interesting or funny anecdotes, attention-grabbing graphics, and powerful quotes. I'm biased, but I always advocate for substance over style. These strategies may make for memorable moments in class, but can't overcome inconsistencies in your learning or assessment design. The rest of it, nonverbal communication, eye contact, enthusiasm, will all come with time. You can accelerate that process though if you practice presenting out aloud to your webcam. I made a video all about how to present in online conferences that may help, linked in the description below. Hope that was helpful, and good luck for your first lecture. This is the BioLab Collective. I'm Jack Wei, and I'll see you in the next video.